Welcome everyone and congratulations if you have been sober for long enough to know and to remember that this day, 86 years ago, Dr. Robert Smith founded Alcoholic Anonymous, the mutual aid fellowship with the purpose of enabling its members to stay sober and help other alcoholics achieve and maintain sobriety through their 12 steps program. Instead, what we're going to be doing today is a 45-step program. The steps that will take us through all of the raids that we have seen in this game, that I am going to rank based on my personal preference, how difficult they were to progress through, what was the state of the game at the time, if it made playing the raids better or if it made them playing worse. We will see some examples of that. And I think it would have been a pretty interesting experiment to have, since unlike many Zoomers listening to this right now, I have actually been playing since vanilla and actually progressed on almost every single one of these 45 raids. And I can make use of my long memory for this, starting from vanilla. This is, ironically, one of the easiest ones to relate to, since we have just moved on from World of Warcraft Classic, so some of you might have revisited these raids recently. I'm starting very quickly by putting Molten Core and Onyxia's Lair in the 600 Raider IO tier, also known as the D tier. You have to understand, this was the first version of the game. Blizzard had basically no idea what to do. They didn't even know that raids would become the main selling point for PvE encounters, for PvE activities in the game, so the raids were very bare bones. You could barely even call them having mechanics. It was more like the challenge of gathering 40 people together, playing at 10 FPS on CRT monitors, keyboard turning and all of that. So the raids, you have to take them for what they were. Nostalgically, with a smile on your face, but they weren't that great. However, as we go a little bit further, Blizzard starts learning. So Blackwing Lair goes a tier above. Certified not keyboard turner, C tier, where you have Blackwing Lair, which was clearly more sophisticated than Molten Core. We clearly start seeing more mechanics and more things that you actually require coordination for, way more than Molten Core. Same can be said for what follows for the next few months. We will get Zul'Gurub, we will get the Ruins and the Temple of Ankh-Raj, and all three have similar, heightened difficulty and mechanics compared to Molten Core, but still, all in all, pretty simple. The peak of the expansion is going to be with Naxxramas, which gets into the B tier, which is actually, a decent tier, a good tier. Unfortunately, at the time, it couldn't be experienced by too many players, very few people actually got to try out Naxxramas, but it was decent, especially compared to the times that you were in, 15, 16 years ago. Now, we jump into TBC now, and we jump into Karazhan, the first raid. Some people might be shocked. They are seeing Karazhan into the bottom, very low. How? I love Karazhan. Well, I think Karazhan is shit. Karazhan was terrible. I'm gonna say it outright for people who do not remember. And unfortunately, you won't be able to see this. You won't be able to know what I mean playing TBC Classic. But Burning Crusade was the worst expansion for raid pacing. Blizzard completely fucked up the way they rolled out the raids and the difficulty of the raids. They created massive issues. One of these issues was Karazhan, starting with a 10-man raid when you were downscaling from 40 to 25 for absolutely no reason, and making it super easy showering people in epics. It gave people the completely wrong impression of what the expansion was going to be. What was going to be was a bully with a metal bat bashing your fucking teeth in. That's what Serpent Shrine Caverns and Tempest Keep were. That's why I can't forgive Karazhan as a raid tier. It did terrible damage to the progression of guilds in Burning Crusade. On the other hand, a little bit of a thumbs up for Gruul's Lair, because it was an actually good raid, or rather an actually good boss, Gruul, and also spitting on the grave of Magtheridon. He deserves to wipe in LFR tier because it was obscenely overtuned. It was basically unkilled by most guilds for months. People even gave up trying to even deal with Magtheridon because of how overtuned it was, so it was a terrible release of a raid boss. Talking about the bully with the metal bat, Serpent Shrine Cavern and Tempest Keep, which end up at the bottom as well. These two raids to this day, despite the fact that we don't have very clear rankings and data, I can guarantee you, okay, I can certify it for you, these were the two biggest raid cockblocks in the history of the game. They gatekept so many guilds from continuing to progress. They were so much harder and even so much higher of a barrier of entry to be able to progress in the first place than Karazhan that killed hundreds of guilds. Even just the farming necessary, the grinding required for your tanks to get resistances, the nature and cold resistances were enough to start this recruitment hunting of guilds stealing each other's tanks. Not to mention the fiasco, the unbalanced and broken fiasco of both Lady Vash and Kel'Thas. So they ended up being a pretty big problem in the middle of the expansion as the two main, essentially, activities for PvE. And the disaster continues. As I said, TBC was the worst expansion for raid progression. Black Temple and Mount Tigel. Mount Tigel goes at the bottom into the E tier, and then Black Temple goes into the D tier, the 600 Raider IO player, because, and this time we have a different type of problem, they were very under-tuned. I don't know what Blizzard was doing in TBC, honestly. After Tempest Keep and SSC, which were very overtuned for the general player base, people started just mowing through Mount Tigel and Black Temple. It wasn't out of the question, like our guild, to literally kill the first 4 bosses of Mount Tigel in a single night. Same goes for Black Temple. In a single reset, you could just chew through the first 6 or 7 bosses. The first real cockblock of Black Temple would have been Sharaz, and that's just because, again, the grinding of resistances, shadow resistance this time. So both raids for the following tier of TBC were rolled out really, really badly, just for basically the opposite reason of the previous ones, Tempest Keep and Serpent Shrine Caverns. I'm going to put Zulaman into the middle. They are not a keyboard turner because that was a little bit more nicely balanced. This was supposed to be, initially this was supposed to be, as Blizzard's statement, a treat to raiders. It was supposed to be a special hard mode given just to high-end raiders, except when they needed to roll it out, they realized they had so many guilds unable to enter SSC and TK that they had no gear, they had no way to progress, they had been stuck for months in Karazhan and Gruul's lair, so they added a normal loot piñata mode to Zulaman to allow those people stuck in Karazhan to start getting some decent gear, since they weren't getting it in Serpent Shrine Caverns and Tempest Keep. Even beyond that, it was a decent mini-raid. Sunwell Plateau, on the other hand, goes back next to Black Temple. That was also a very overtuned raid. It was a rushed raid. Rumors say that the last raid of the expansion was supposed to be Black Temple, and the reason why Sunwell Plateau was scrapped together so quickly was because people, as mentioned, were chewing through Black Temple and Mount Tigel way too fast. So Blizzard opted for a contingency plan of just throwing in this new raid very quickly together. Even if you discount that rumor, the raid wasn't very nicely done. It was very overtuned. The damage, the tank damage on Brutalus, sending people insane, particularly Holy Paladins, and Muru as well, not very well made. This closes TBC, as it was the worst raid expansion that we have had. Really, really bad job by Blizzard in that expansion. So instead we can move in Wrath of the Lich King. Well, it doesn't start as well, because we have Naxxramas and the Obsidian Sanctum. I'm gonna leave Naxxramas where it was, in actually good. You know, many people who didn't try it in vanilla got to try it again in Wrath of the Lich King. They added something to keep you a little bit interested, which was the Immortal title, or the Undying title. You know, clear the entire raid without having your raid die once on any boss. That gave it a little bit more shine. Obsidian Sanctum, on the other hand, was garbage. It was extremely undertuned, which allowed you to just bomb rush Sartarion in its supposed hard mode. Wrath of the Lich King was the expansion where Blizzard started tinkering with hard modes, right? And unfortunately, the first one they tried out, Obsidian Sanctum, went horribly, because it was very, very simple. What wasn't simple, and what was very good, was the Eye of Eternity, also known as Malygos. We have our first A tier, also known as Fire Mage. Malygos was a very good fight, it was a very good encounter, and it was easily the hardest of the first tier of Wrath of the Lich King, and it was just nicely done. Yeah, maybe some people might dislike the last phase, the last minigame, but the rest of the fight was very, very nice. Yes, of course, I'm not that edgy, I'm not that much of a hipster. I am putting Ulduar in the S tier, in the Hall of Fame tier. Very good raid, very good fights, just not much to say about it, it was just very well done. Unfortunately, very likely Blizzard made a pact with the gods of raiding, because after Ulduar they had to come up with Trial of the Crusader. An abomination. Not much needs to be said here, goes straight to the bottom. The fights were super undertuned, all of the first fights, just one shot all of them until you get to Anubarak, which is then overtuned in return. Blizzard also tried to add the maximum amount of prize per week to this raid, which made people even more pissed. This was also the raid that didn't have tier sets, or rather added scuffed tier sets, not really good compared to Ulduar and what would be Icecrown, so made people even more annoyed. So not very good at all. Now for Icecrown. Maybe you will receive this the same way as me putting Karazhan low, but I am putting Icecrown in the middle. One of the issues of Icecrown is that it was slightly undertuned. The only decently tuned bosses were Putricide, partly Sindragosa, and then the Lich King itself. I do consider the Lich King, the fight, the hard mode fight, the heroic fight, very, very good and very nicely balanced. However, the rest of the raid just wasn't up to par. I know it's sort of a picky complaint, but it was very, very similar and repeated in terms of scenarios, in terms of art. Yes, we get it, we are in Icecrown, we are in this Saronite constructed tower, but it kind of gets a little bit samey. You can see in Ulduar how you can get different types of environments, different types of scenery for all the different bosses very nicely. Whereas in Icecrown it was just very, very, very samey, and it kind of grew kind of tiring a little bit the more you just kept going and you saw the same things over and over. So I never quite got into Icecrown. Then we move into Cataclysm, the forgotten expansion that people don't really talk about ever. They just assume it doesn't exist, they just leave it out. You would be wrong, because the first part of Cataclysm when it comes to raiding is amongst the most solid of raid tiers. Both Bastion of Twilight and Turn of the Four Winds, as well as Blackwind Descent, were very solid raids. Yeah, okay, Turn of the Four Winds was a mini raid, but still, they were good raids, which got your hopes up, because this was the expansion, with Deathwing, and even we knew beforehand we would have gotten the remake of Ragnaros, this time in his own lair, in his own domain, right? So there was hype, there was excitement for it. No Megalul, to be precise, because Firelands and Dragonsoul ended up being disasters. Firelands I am putting into the D tier, not even 600 Red possibly 500, because the raid was pretty frustrating in terms of mechanic on several of the bosses, and then maybe you can still salvage the raid because you have Ragnaros, maybe you can get to Ragnaros and the entire raid would make sense, except Ragnaros was the worst part. It was a very bad fight, a very long fight, and a very frustrating fight. It is one of the contenders for the title of Guild Killer, Guild Breaker, because of how difficult it was to chew through this boss. And now that you were beaten after going through the Firelands, you were still hoping, hooked on copium, that Dragonsoul and Deathwing would have salvaged everything in the end, except it was even worse. Dragonsoul was the first in a line of very long tiers, almost or over a year-long tiers of this very long raids with very many bosses. It took forever to clear, and then the madness of Deathwing and the spine of Deathwing, Blizzard trying to split the raid boss in two just to show how big he was. Well, the fights turned out to be bad. Not as much the madness of Deathwing, so the actual fight with Deathwing, but the spine. It was not good, okay? It was not a good fight. The rest of the raid wasn't even that bad, it was just very long. But then, after going through all that length, you had to deal with the spine. No. I will not take this. I mean, I did, but I'm sure many people didn't and gave up. And their guild broke, trying to go through that. Understandable, to be honest. I do regret doing it, for my own sanity, if anything. Then we start Mist of Pandaria. It's important to talk about this because just like I mentioned Cataclysm starting very well, and just like I mentioned TBC being very bad as a whole when it comes to raid tiers, Mist of Pandaria has the best battery of raid tiers of this game. I will debate anyone on this. Mist of Pandaria is untouched when it comes to the quality of raids. We have Mogushan Vaults, Terrace of Endless Springs and Heart of Fear, all three of them into the B tier, into actually good. It is, in my opinion, the strongest and the best first raid tier that we have ever had in this game. When the competition you have is Molten Core, or Karazhan, Gruul's Lair, and Magteridon's Lair, or Emerald Nightmare, or Uldir. All these three combined easily crush all of them. All three were very good. All three last bosses were very good and nicely tuned. They weren't as frustrating, and the chances were high, right? We were just coming off of the Spine of Deathwing, we were just coming off of Ragnaros, and instead we get the Will of the Emperor, we get the Empress, and we get the Shah. And all three fights were very nice. The rest of the fights in the three raids were also very nicely done. The Orb fight on the first boss of Art of Fear before it got nerfed was also insane. All three of the raids were very nicely paced and tuned, so great quality. What's even better is that what follows is even of a higher quality, because what follows is Throne of Thunder. Throne of Thunder is our second Hall of Fame raid. Amazing raid. I would put it above Ulduar, but I just don't want to make an extra tier just for it. Very, very nicely done. Amazing last fight with Lei Shen. So, great raid here. And Mist of Pandaria also finishes on a strong note as well, because we have Siege of Orgrimmar. The only reason why I'm putting Siege of Orgrimmar into Fire Mage tier and not Hall of Fame tier is because it lasted for over a year. I think it lasted for 14 months. So people's opinion of Siege of Orgrimmar diminishes a little bit over time. You know, if Siege was like 7 months long or 8 months long, it's likely that people's opinion would have lasted better through time. Instead, now they just have this memory of being perpetually stuck for months into this tier, so it felt a little bit worse, but the raid itself was quality. You know, Black Fuse, the Paragons, and Garrosh himself are amongst the strongest trio of last bosses I can remember in a raid. Very, very good. After Mist, everyone, at least raiders, were in high hopes. Blizzard was on a very nice streak of good raids, and they ruin everything because Warlords of Draenor starts with Heimel. Heimel was pretty bad. The only reason why I'm not putting Heimel at the absolute bottom is because of Imperator Margot. Amazing fight as a last boss, very nicely tuned, did not need too much adjustment. The fight itself was great, however the rest of the raid wasn't very good, very exciting. Then we have Blackrock Foundry, one of the more unceremonious raids being dropped in an expansion. It just went by like nothing, very, very short as well in terms of time you had to deal with Blackrock Foundry. However, the raid itself was pretty good. Blackrock Foundry was a pretty good raid, it just was very short for you, because very quickly after, Hellfire Citadel was launched. I am putting Hellfire Citadel in the middle. Again, similar to Siege, Hellfire Citadel was one of these very long, 1 year long tiers that people got stuck in for months and months and months, so probably you have a worse opinion on this because of this reason, because of this fact. However, the raid itself was pretty good. Worlds of Draenor's problem wasn't as much that the raids were bad, it's the fact that you only had 3 of them, and that Heimel was also very short, so you had this feeling that you didn't really have much to do throughout the course of the expansion, which is also why most people's memories of Warlords is sitting in your garrison with 15 different characters farming gold, pretty much. Then we get into Legion. Man, we're getting close. Legion starts with an abomination known as Emerald Nightmare. Emerald Nightmare goes straight to the bottom. It is unforgivable, to be honest, to have such a weak last boss. With no contest, Xavius is the easiest last boss ever made by Blizzard, shockingly undertuned. You might even say, well, you know what, Denatrius is kind of easier than Stone Legion. Yes, it is, but not to this extent. Xavius was an absolute joke. It took people roughly 2 hours of progress, unironically, to deal with Xavius after dealing with Cenarius. Yes, sure, Il'gynoth was hard, Cenarius himself was also hard, but they were also hard for the wrong reasons. Il'gynoth was very frustrating to deal with, having to metagame the AI of these stupid blobs and drag them in front of the eye, and then you had Cenarius, which was a very frustrating DPS fight. Also slightly RNG based. So the raid itself wasn't very entertaining, on top of being rather short. Blizzard fixed this though, because they released Trial of Valor. Now, I don't want to be too much of a hipster, so I'm just gonna put Trial of Valor into the Fire Mage tier. Personally, I would have put him into the S tier, into the Hall of Fame. I think it's a great 3-boss raid. I guess I can explain this by docking the points because of how overtuned it was. At the release, Trial of Valor was obscene. Odin and Guarm were just awfully overtuned. Not even mentioning Helya, because people couldn't even get to Helya for the first weeks because of how hard Odin and Guarm were. So I guess that's the explanation for not putting it into the S tier, but all three fights were very nice and very different in how they worked. I liked it a lot. I also liked what came after. So after the horribleness of Emerald Nightmare, we start going into the upswing. After Trial of Valor, you get the Nighthold. I also think I could and should have put Nighthold into the S tier. I think it's an amazing raid. Elisande, I think it's an amazing fight. Star Ogre Atreus, despite the triggering of people who can't play pairs, it was also an amazing fight, and you have, of course, Gul'dan himself. So I do believe it was a very, very high quality raid, and I'm already kind of feeling bad about not putting into the S tier. Still, very good quality raid. Now, what follows is a pair. Unfortunately, after Trial of Valor and Nighthold, we have Tomb of Sargeras and Antorus. I am putting them both into the middle. Both raids were very good looking. They have very nice aesthetics, very nice kind of atmosphere around the bosses and around the raids themselves. However, both of them, in particular Antorus, was kind of the extreme usage of third-party software to be able to deal with encounters. This was probably the highest point we reached of dependency on things like Wikoras or additional softwares that helped you deal with all the shit Blizzard was throwing at you. Since then, I don't think Blizzard reached that point again. Tomb of Sargeras and especially Antorus were sort of the peak, and since then we have gone a little bit further down, but those two were kind of a little bit overtuned on that end. Now we are back into modern times because we are entering BFA. So we are starting with Uldir. Uldir was a decent, no hate, no love, just fine raid. None of the bosses were particularly overtuned. It does deserve some flack, some flame, which is why it doesn't go above the mid for the way the Zul fight was developed, which was very unhealthy for the game. It also gave the wrong impression to hundreds of rogue players that subtlety would have been good. Spoiler, it wouldn't. And then also the thing with Mithrax and the absolute genocide of melee DPS. So it did have some creaks here and there, but overall it was a decent raid. What follows is, I think, another good set of raids. Crucible of Storms and Battle of the Zarlor. Crucible of Storms I am putting into the B tier and Battle of the Zarlor into the A tier. Crucible of Storms was good, but it was a little bit too dependent on class stacking. The ways the mechanics centered around both boss fights, specifically the first one with absorbs and basically trying to get immunities and take less damage, and the second one, the last one, Unat, with either Anks and combat dresses as well as teleports, kind of soured the experience a little bit. Not for me, because I was playing Shaman, so I got away with it, but for other people, surely. Battle of the Zarlor was better. First of all, good, great aesthetics. After all, it was in the Zarlor, and the Zarlor looked great. It had some pretty cool fights, some pretty engaging fights. I know some people did not and don't like Jaina as a fight, but I did enjoy it a lot. I think it was a very nicely tuned raid. What followed was Eternal Palace. So Eternal Palace doesn't go as high as BOD, because I did enjoy Zakul as a fight. I did enjoy Ajara a lot as a fight. However, that was the start of the overbearingness of borrowed powers, which would then continue on in Nyalotha. This was the essences. This was the start of some classes starting to get slightly out of hand with their power. So even though the raid was nice, it stays into the B tier, very high quality raid, you kind of got a look into what would have happened later in Nyalotha. Which is why Nyalotha goes into the C tier, into the middle, because that was the corruption fiesta. The raid itself was very thematic. I know many people are kind of sad that we are not getting a Black Empire expansion, so we only get this very cool aesthetics, very cool scenarios and setting only for a single raid. However, it still looked super cool. All of the backgrounds and the boss rooms were very cool. However, I'm not putting it above the middle simply because of the several problems you had, because of corruptions and because of class stacking that re-emerged very heavily in Nyalotha. You didn't have as much necessary class or spec stacking in Eternal Palace and in BOD, but in Nyalotha, the immunities on Zoth were very important. You had the spread and dot cleave on Drestagath, as well as the burst damage required for Drestagath. Same goes for burst damage on Hivemind. It just exacerbated the problem with the corruption, because it just so happened that all of the specs with those good damage profiles happened to be the specs that were scaling the hardest. Fire Mage, Beast Mastery Hunter, Destruction Warlock, Havoc Demon Hunter. So it just soured the whole thing a little bit for me. And with Nyalota, that was the end. We are done with all the raids. There is only Castle Natria left, which we can already put here because it's been long enough. It's been like 7 months of Castle Natria, so we can give it a rating. I can give it a rating. A tier. Very high. I enjoyed Castle Natria a lot. I think it was a great raid. I think the Natrius is a great fight. Very nice fight. The reason why it doesn't make it into the S tier. So the setting is great. The atmosphere, the backdrops and backgrounds and the different types of bosses are nice. There is a good spread of damage profiles, some consistent damage, some burst damage, some cleave, etc, etc. It's all good. However, a problem. Stone Legion Generals, first of all, kind of soured the whole tier. It was way too overtuned, not just in how difficult it was to go through it, but in the amount of mechanics you had to chew through to get past it. And also, it does kind of sour the last boss, when you make the previous boss harder than the last. As I mentioned like 15 minutes ago, it's not as bad as the difference between Cenarius and Xavius in Emerald Nightmare, but it was still a noticeable difference in difficulty between SLG and the Natrius, which is why for me it stays into a very solid A tier raid. Now with this, we have all of the raids since vanilla, excluding some of the meme ones like Ruby Sanctum, Baradin Hold, maybe even UBRS, if you want to count it as a raid. This is what we are left with. I guess if I wanted to make a final point is that the latest raid tiers of the last couple of expansions have been at a slightly higher average. We have gotten some consistent quality after Trial of Valor, Nighthold, BOD, Eternal Palace, Castle Natria, so we have kept up pretty nicely in raid quality for a while now, actually. We haven't gotten one of those missteps like Firelands, like Emerald Nightmare, like Dragon Soul for like 5 years now. So it bodes pretty well for Sanctum of Domination. Let's hope it's gonna be at least into the B tier. I am confident it could be above, at least into the A tier, given the recent quality of raids. Let me guys know anyways, what's your opinion about these raids, particularly the ones you think are the most contradictory to your own opinion. I'm sure many of you will think, Karazhan is a marvel of the universe and maybe Siege of Orgrimmar was absolutely terrible, so you might have some completely different opinion on the quality of these raids. As usual, if you enjoyed this video, you are welcome to subscribe to the channel, but you should also keep in mind that if you do not, you are going to be stuck for the next 14 months in Dragon Soul. So, see you guys soon, probably tomorrow. And in the meantime, yeah, I should have definitely put Nighthold in S. My bad.